The laughter reached her before she even crossed the threshold. It was the particular kind of laughter that society women had perfected over generations. Bright on the surface, sharp beneath, designed to wound without leaving a mark that could be pointed to later. It floated across the ballroom of Ashford House on a stream of candlelight and expensive perfume, and it was, without question, directed at Miss Cecily Ashbourne. She stood in the doorway and heard it, and she did not flinch. She had learned not to flinch. 3 seasons of being the plainest girl in any room had taught her that flinching only invited more laughter. One kept one's chin up. One kept walking. One pretended, with every particle of dignity one possessed, that one had not heard. "Too plain for any lord," Lady Worthington was saying, not troubling to lower her voice, her fan moving in lazy arcs before her powdered face. 3 seasons and not so much as a single offer. Her mother must be in despair. "Can you blame her?" her companion replied. "The girl has no fortune, no connections, and that face. Perfectly pleasant, I suppose, if one were searching for a companion or a governess. But a wife? For a lord?" The laughter again, silver and cruel. Cecily walked forward. She had worn her best dress tonight, a soft of gray silk that her mother had spent a month's household allowance on, determined that this season would be different, that this ball would change everything. It was a pretty dress. Cecily knew it was a pretty dress. It simply could not make her beautiful, and beauty, in the world she inhabited, was the currency upon which everything else was purchased. She was not ugly. She understood that much. Her features were regular, her complexion clear, her hair a warm brown that caught the light agreeably enough. But she was not Arabella Fentworth with her golden curls and her laughing blue eyes, and she was not Diana Cavendish with her legendary cheekbones and her effortless grace. And in a world where men chose wives the way they chose horses, primarily on the basis of appearance and bloodline, not Arabella and not Diana amounted to much the same thing as nothing at all. 3 seasons. 3 seasons of watching other girls receive flowers and dance cards and carefully worded declarations while she sat with the chaperones and discussed the weather. 3 seasons of her mother's increasingly desperate matchmaking and her father's increasingly strained finances and the quiet, creeping terror of understanding that she might simply be left over, like the last pastry on a plate that no one quite wanted. Cecily walked into the ballroom and took her place against the wall. She was 24 years old, and she was very, very tired of being invisible. She did not know, could not possibly have known, that on the other side of the room, a man had just arrived who would change everything. She did not know that tonight everything would be different. There were things one knew about Edmund Ravenswood, Duke of Blackmore, before one ever entered a room with him. One knew that he was 36 years old and had never married, despite the most concerted campaign of matrimonial pursuit in London's recent memory. One knew that his estates were vast, his fortune was incomprehensible, and his title was older than most of the families currently jostling for his attention. One knew that he had served the crown in ways that were not publicly discussed, that he had returned from the continent 3 years ago with a scar along his left jaw and eyes that had seen things most men spent their entire lives avoiding. One knew, above all, that he did not come to balls. The Duke of Blackmore attended precisely the obligations his position demanded and not a single social engagement. He did not dance. He did not flirt. He did not stand in receiving lines and exchange pleasantries about the weather. He arrived, if he arrived at all, spoke to whomever required speaking to on matters of consequence, and departed before the supper waltz. Society women had been constructing elaborate strategies to capture his attention for 3 years, and 3 years of elaborate strategies had produced nothing but a collection of politely worded rejections and a growing mythology about the coldness of his heart. The Ice Duke, they called him when they dared. A man who feels nothing, some said. A man who has forgotten how, said others who claimed to know more than they did. Cecily had heard all of it. Living on the margins of society meant hearing everything eventually, because people forgot to lower their voices around wallflowers. She had constructed her own private portrait of the Duke of Blackmore from scraps of gossip and rumor. A tall, cold, impossibly formidable man who moved through the world like a storm front, leaving disruption in his wake. She had no particular interest in him. Men like the Duke of Blackmore did not concern themselves with women like Cecily Ashbourne. That was simply the mathematics of the world she inhabited. Or so she believed, standing at her customary post against the east wall of Ashford House's ballroom, watching the dancers move through the figures of a country dance. Her expression pleasantly neutral, her inner life entirely invisible, as it always was. She did not see him enter. She only noticed him when the room changed. It was subtle at first. A slight shift in the quality of attention, a fractional reorientation of bodies, the way conversation stuttered and resumed in a slightly different register. Cecily had been watching society long enough to recognize the particular electricity that accompanied the arrival of someone significant. She looked toward the entrance, and found Edmund Ravenswood, Duke of Blackmore, looking directly at her. He was not what she had expected. She had expected something more obviously formidable, the embodiment of the mythology, all cold hauteur and impenetrable distance. And those qualities were there, certainly. He was tall, broad-shouldered in his severe black evening coat, his face composed in lines of absolute composure, his dark eyes scanning the room with the unhurried certainty of a man who has never once doubted his right to be wherever he happens to find himself. But there was something else in his face too, something she had not expected and could not immediately name. A quality of tiredness, perhaps. Not the tiredness of a man who has stayed too long at a party. The deeper tiredness of a man who has been performing a particular role for so long that he can no longer quite remember the person beneath. She understood that tiredness with every fiber of her being. His gaze swept across the room and briefly, impossibly, landed on her. Cecily felt it like a hand pressed flat against her sternum. Then his gaze moved on, continuing its methodical survey of the assembled company, and she exhaled slowly and told herself she had imagined the moment of contact entirely. Men like the Duke of Blackmore did not see women like Cecily Ashbourne. That was simply how the world worked. She turned back to the dancers and tried to remember that. Lord Fenwick found her 20 minutes later. He was not a bad man. Cecily was scrupulously fair about such things, but he was a boring one, a minor baronet of limited imagination and unlimited self-satisfaction who had been hovering at the edge of her family's acquaintance for 2 seasons on the apparent theory that her lack of alternative options would eventually render her grateful for his attention. "Miss Ashbourne," he said, settling into the chair beside her with the comfortable confidence of a man claiming territory. "I see you are sitting out again. A shame. You dance tolerably well." "Tolerably well." Cecily smiled and did not say anything. "You have heard, I suppose, that Blackmore has come tonight," Lord Fenwick continued, helping himself to a glass of champagne from a passing tray without offering one to her. "Extraordinary thing. I cannot imagine what brought him. He despises these affairs." "Perhaps he had his reasons," Cecily said. "The mothers are already circling," Lord Fenwick went on with the satisfaction of a man who enjoys observing conflict he need not participate in. "Lady Hartwell has been positioning Diana toward him for the past quarter hour. As if the man would look at anyone who wasn't a princess." He chuckled. "No offense to the present company, of course." "None taken," Cecily said very evenly. Lord Fenwick had not, in fact, meant offense. That was the worst of it. He had not needed to mean offense. The offense was simply present in the air, like dampness, requiring no active production. She was saved from further conversation by Lady Sefton, one of Almac's patronesses, who swept past in a wave of blue silk and beckoned Lord Fenwick away to meet someone. He went with evident relief, and Cecily was left alone again with the dancers and the candlelight and the distant sound of Lady Worthington's laughter. She should have gone to find her mother. She should have circulated, as her mother always urged her to, presenting herself strategically in the paths of eligible men, deploying whatever assets she possessed, her wit, her education, her genuine warmth, in the service of matrimonial aspiration. She did not. Instead, she retrieved a book from her reticule. A small volume of natural philosophy she had tucked there in a moment of rebellious optimism, and began to read. It was, by every social standard, an appalling thing to do at a ball. She knew it was appalling. She did it anyway because she was 24 years old and tired, and the book was more interesting than watching men ignore her. She did not notice when the conversation near her shifted. She did not hear Lady Worthington's group migrate closer, Drawn by some social current she was too absorbed to observe. She was deep in an argument about the nature of planetary orbits when the voice above her said, quite distinctly, "Good heavens! Is she reading?" Laughter. The particular kind. "At a ball," someone confirmed. "Reading. Like a blue stocking," Lady Worthington supplied. "I always suspected. It explains so much, doesn't it?" More laughter. "Poor Mrs. Ashbourne. 3 seasons and the girl has given up entirely and taken to reading in corners. Can you blame her? If I were too plain for any lord, I might prefer books as well." Cecily lowered her book. She met Lady Worthington's gaze steadily, with the particular expression she had cultivated over years of practice. Composed, undisturbed, the face of a woman who had heard worse and survived it. "Cassini's treatise on planetary motion," she said pleasantly. "Have you read it? The mathematics of celestial orbits are quite remarkable. Though I confess I find most things more interesting than standing in ballrooms being assessed." She smiled. Lady Worthington's eyes narrowed. "How charming," she said, in the tone that meant precisely the opposite. "The little mouse bites." "Only when provoked," Cecily said. "Your Grace." The last 2 words were not addressed to Lady Worthington. They were addressed to the man who had appeared at the edge of the group with the noiselessness of a man accustomed to moving through difficult terrain, and whose expression, as he surveyed the assembled women and the book in Cecily's lap and the faint flush of humiliation she could not quite suppress, was doing something complicated that she could not immediately interpret. The Duke of Blackmore looked at Lady Worthington with an expression of absolute, glacial indifference. "Lady Worthington," he said, and his voice was the coldest thing in the room. "I did not know you had an interest in natural philosophy." The implied conclusion hung in the air. "Since you clearly do not, I fail to understand why you are discussing a book you have not read with a woman who clearly has." Lady Worthington's color rose. "Your Grace, I was not, you were simply interrupting Miss Ashbourne's reading," the Duke said. "A pity. Cassini is not a man to be interrupted midway through." He looked at Cecily then, and she understood with a shock of physical impact that he had heard all of it. Every word. The laughter, the assessment, the cruelty delivered with the particular brightness society women used to make cruelty presentable. He had heard it, and he had walked directly toward it, and he was standing here now in the most exclusive ballroom in London, beside the most consistently ignored woman in 3 seasons, and he was talking to her about planetary orbits. "I agree," Cecily said carefully. "The argument regarding Jupiter's moons in particular is not one that benefits from interruption." Something shifted in the Duke's expression. Not quite a smile. The architecture of his face seemed to resist the full construction of a smile, but the suggestion of one. The ghost of the intention. "I apologize for the intrusion," he said, "though I confess I was not passing by entirely by accident. I have been looking for somewhere in this room where an interesting conversation might be occurring." He looked at her book, then at her face. "I believe I have found it." Lady Worthington and her companions withdrew in the dignified manner of people pretending they had intended to leave anyway, their fans moving in agitated arcs that Cecily had learned to read as the social equivalent of retreat with grievances. The Duke of Blackmore lowered himself into the chair Lord Fenwick had vacated, with the unhurried ease of a man who has decided to stay and intends to be comfortable about it. He was taller sitting down than most men were standing, Cecily thought, which was an observation so absurd she almost said it aloud. "I should warn you," she said instead, "that sitting beside me is not considered a socially advantageous position. The general consensus is that I am the least eligible woman at any gathering I attend." "The general consensus," the Duke said, with a flatness that contained something she thought might be dark humor, "is very often wrong. In this particular case, it has the weight of 3 seasons of empirical evidence behind it. Empirical evidence gathered by people who were measuring the wrong thing." His dark eyes moved to her face with a directness that society convention discouraged and that she found, to her surprise, more steadying than unsettling. "What is the book?" She showed him the cover. Something in his face shifted again. Genuine this time, unmistakable. "I read this in Brussels," he said quietly. "The winter before last." Brussels, she said. In some professional capacity, I assume. Given your reputation for avoiding all unnecessary activity. My reputation, he said, is approximately half accurate. I avoid unnecessary social activity. I find other things considerably more worthwhile, such as reading natural philosophy in Brussels in winter. Among other things, they looked at each other. Cecily was aware that the room had noticed this exchange, could feel the particular vibration of 300 pairs of eyes redirecting themselves, and found, to her considerable surprise, that she did not particularly care. You should know, she said, that I am not going to be grateful. He frowned slightly. I beg your pardon? For the intervention. Lady Worthington's group. I appreciate the impulse, and I am not unaware that you have done me a service, but I am not going to show gratitude about it. I did not require rescuing. The thing that was almost a smile returned to his face, stronger now, more definite. No, he said. I rather thought you did not. You had already drawn first blood when I arrived. Only second blood, she corrected. They drew first. Of course. A pause. Miss Ashbourne. Your Grace. Edmund. She blinked. I beg your pardon? My name. Edmund. He said it as though testing the sound of it in this context, this ballroom, this particular conversation. I find myself tired of titles this evening. They feel like walls, and I have enough of those already. Cecily studied him. This man who had not come to a ball in 3 years and had chosen her corner of it to sit in, who had read Cassini in Brussels and who looked, beneath all the frost and the formidable reputation, like someone who had been carrying something very heavy for a very long time. Cecily, she said. Something in his face unlocked. Just fractionally. Just enough. Tell me about Jupiter's moons, he said. And she did. They talked for 40 minutes. It was not the longest conversation Cecily had ever had at a ball. That distinction belonged to a dreary evening 3 seasons ago when she had been cornered by an elderly general with opinions about the Napoleonic campaigns. But it was unquestionably the most interesting. The Duke, Edmund, spoke about celestial mechanics with the precision of a man who had actually studied them, asked questions that revealed genuine engagement rather than polite interest, and argued a point about gravitational theory with a focused intensity that made Cecily forget, for long stretches at a time, that they were sitting against a wall at a ball in London while 300 people tried not to stare at them. She forgot to be invisible. She forgot to be careful, to moderate herself, to perform the pleasant blankness that society expected from women who had not yet managed to make themselves into wives. She was simply herself, and it felt, in the most alarming way, like putting down a weight she had been carrying so long she had forgotten it was heavy. He noticed when she caught herself. You do that, he said during a brief pause, when she had checked some observation mid-delivery and rephrased it into something blander. Do what? Edit yourself. You were about to say something, and then you decided not to, and said something smaller instead. Cecily considered denying it, and then remembered that she had told him she would not perform gratitude. It seemed inconsistent to perform modestly. It is a habit, she said. 3 seasons teaches a woman to make herself digestible. Large opinions and inconvenient intellect are not considered attractive qualities. By whom? By the general consensus. Which, he reminded her, is very often wrong. She looked at him. You are an unusual man, Your Grace. Edmund, you are an unusual man. So I have been told. He paused. Though rarely as a compliment. I meant it as one. Another fractional shift in his expression. Something warmer, something she was not sure she was meant to see. He looked away toward the dancers, and the moment closed like a door shutting quietly in a distant room. The supper waltz will be announced soon, he said. It was not a question, and it was not a segue. It hung in the air without clear purpose. It will, Cecily agreed. A pause. Dance with me, he said. The 3 words fell into the conversation like stones into still water, sending ripples outward in all directions. Cecily was very still. Your Grace, she said carefully, are you aware that you do not dance? It is something of a settled article of social knowledge. I am aware. And you are aware that dancing with me, with specifically me after this conversation in full view of everyone present, will be interpreted in a particular way. I am aware, he said again, and this time the flatness of his voice was intentional, decisive. I find I don't particularly care. Cecily looked at him for a long moment, searching his face for the particular variety of masculine caprice that she had learned to identify over 3 seasons. The impulse that expressed itself in brief attention followed by rapid, painful withdrawal. She did not find it. What she found instead was something she had no word for. Something deliberate, considered. Very well, she said. She took his offered hand and felt the room hold its breath. The waltz was extraordinary. Not because of the dancing itself. Edmund danced with the controlled precision of a man who had learned ballroom technique as a tactical skill rather than a social grace, efficient and correct and entirely without flourish, but because of what happened in the space between the steps. He danced with her as though she were the only person in the room. Not the performance of that. Not the social mimicry of attention designed to secure an advantage. He danced with her as though 300 people were not watching with their mouths slightly open, as though Lady Worthington were not practically vibrating in the corner, as though the entire social calculus of the evening had not just been upended by a man who did not dance choosing to dance. With her, the plain one, the overlooked one, the one who read books at balls and had nothing to recommend her. You have made a considerable spectacle, Cecily said quietly, as he guided her through a turn. Have I? Everyone is staring. Everyone was already staring at you, he said. For the wrong reasons. I have merely given them something more interesting to stare at. Cecily felt heat rise in her cheeks. That is not an explanation. It is a partial one. He looked down at her, and the directness of his gaze at this proximity was something she was not entirely prepared for. The fuller explanation requires more time than one waltz allows. Are you proposing to give me additional time? I am proposing, he said carefully, that we continue this conversation somewhere it cannot be observed and dissected and fed to London's gossip machinery before either of us has said anything worth gossiping about. A private meeting between an unmarried woman and a duke of your reputation would be thoroughly gossiped about regardless of content. Then at least the content should be worth it. He paused. My aunt, the Marchioness of Dalton, is hosting a small gathering on Thursday, a musical in the main. She has been asking me to attend for some time. I have been declining. And now I find myself inclined to attend, if I knew that someone else with a taste for natural philosophy would also be there. Cecily was quiet for a moment, listening to the music and the whisper of silk on parquet, and the carefully suppressed noise of a ballroom full of people pretending not to watch them. That would require an invitation, she said finally. My aunt will issue one tomorrow, he said. If you are agreeable. She should have refused. She knew that even as she said what she actually said. Thursday then, she told him. The music ended. He released her with precise formality, offering his arm to escort her from the floor, and they walked through the parted crowd. And it did part, she noticed, in a way it had never parted for her before, as though the proximity of his consequence had retroactively conferred something upon her. Back toward her corner. He did not leave immediately. He stood beside her for another quarter-hour, talking about nothing of consequence with the particular focused attention of a man who had decided something and was in the process of acting on the decision without announcing what the decision was. When he finally took his leave, with a bow that was correct and precise and somehow entirely different from the bows he had offered others that evening, Cecily stood against the east wall of Ashford House and tried to understand what had just happened to her. She did not entirely succeed, but she was aware, in the deep quiet place beneath all the careful armor, of something she had not felt in a very long time. Hope, which was, as she well knew, the most dangerous thing in the world. The Marchioness of Dalton's musical was small, intimate, and exclusively composed of people who were either genuinely musical or genuinely intelligent, which the Marchioness had determined long ago were the only categories worth assembling. Lady Henrietta Ashworth, Marchioness of Dalton, was 63 years old, iron-haired, sharp-tongued, and possessed of the particular authority that accrues to elderly aristocratic women who have outlived all reasonable opposition. She had been Edmund's father's sister, had watched Edmund grow from a solemn, watchful boy into a solemn, watchful man, and had opinions about the direction his life had taken. She expressed these opinions freely and without apology, which was one of the reasons Edmund had been declining her invitations for 2 years. "You came," she said when he arrived Thursday evening, with an expression of satisfaction that made him immediately suspicious. "You invited someone interesting," he said. "I invited 40 people. Several of them are interesting. One of them in particular," he said, and watched his aunt's eyes sharpen with the speed of a woman who had been waiting for exactly this information. "Miss Ashbourne," she said. "Yes, I did notice that you danced with her at the Ashford ball. All of London noticed. The gossip was extraordinary. I am indifferent to gossip. Obviously." She studied him with the unsentimental precision of someone who has loved a person long enough to see clearly. "She is not what society would expect of you, Edmund. No, she is not beautiful in the conventional sense. She has no fortune. Her connections, while respectable, are not distinguished. The match, by any social calculation, Aunt Henrietta, would be considered a significant step down for a man of your Aunt Henrietta." She stopped. He looked at her steadily. "She is the most interesting person I have spoken to in 3 years. She reads Cassini. She does not perform. She told me, to my face, within 10 minutes of our acquaintance, that she was not going to be grateful to me, because she did not require rescuing." A pause. "She sounds impossible," his aunt said. "She sounds," he said, "like someone worth the effort of being a better man." His aunt looked at him for a long moment. Then she patted his arm, once with the brisk efficiency of a woman who has made a decision. "She is in the blue salon," she said, "arguing with Professor Hawthorne about Kepler. He has been wrong about orbital mechanics for 30 years, and she is the first person at any of my gatherings to tell him so to his face." Edmund moved toward the blue salon. She was, in fact, in the middle of an argument. He stood in the doorway for a moment before she noticed him, watching her make her case to an elderly gentleman with the focused energy of a woman who has something worth saying and no intention of softening it for the sake of social comfort. Her hands moved expressively. Her eyes were bright. The carefully composed neutrality he had watched her maintain at the Ashford ball had been entirely abandoned, replaced by something vivid and genuine that transformed her face entirely. He had thought her unremarkable at first glance. He had been wrong. "Miss Ashbourne," he said. She looked up, and for a fraction of a second something crossed her face before she assembled her composure, surprise, and beneath it something warmer. "Your Grace," she said. "You came. I said I would. Men of consequence frequently say things they do not mean, a fact you clearly account for in advance." He moved into the room, acknowledging the other guests with a brief nod that constituted the entirety of the social courtesy he intended to deploy this evening. "I am not in the habit of saying things I do not mean." "No," she said, studying him. "I am beginning to believe that." They talked for 3 hours. Not only the two of them, the gathering was small enough and intelligent enough that conversation moved fluidly between the assembled guests, but always, regardless of how the discussion ranged, they seemed to find themselves in orbit around each other, drawn back by some gravitational logic that neither of them acknowledged directly. Edmund watched her in those moments when she did not know she was being watched, and observed something that confirmed what he had only suspected at the Ashford ball. Cecily Ashbourne was not unremarkable. She was extraordinary in the particular way of people who have spent so long being overlooked that they have stopped performing for observers and simply become themselves, with all the specificity and depth and inconvenient wholeness that entailed. She was witty and precise and capable of genuine warmth that appeared without calculation. She changed her mind when presented with evidence and did not feel the need to disguise the change. She was kind to the Marchioness's elderly footman and merciless with Professor Hawthorne's logical errors, and she treated both responses as entirely natural. He found himself watching for the moments when she edited herself, the small contractions of opinion he had noticed at the Ashford ball, and he noticed that they were happening less frequently tonight. As though, in the smaller, safer space of his aunt's gathering, she felt less compelled to make herself digestible. He wanted to see what she looked like when she felt entirely safe. The wanting surprised him. He was not a man who wanted things. He had spent the better part of a decade systematically eliminating want from his emotional vocabulary, replacing it with duty and obligation and the cold, clean efficiency of a life conducted without reference to anything as dangerous as desire. The work had taken years, and he had believed it complete. It was evidently not complete. "You are watching me," she said, at a quiet moment between conversations, when the other guests had drifted into smaller groupings and they were briefly, relatively alone. "I am," he said, without apology. "It is unsettling. I apologize." "You do not sound particularly apologetic." "No," he agreed. "I am not particularly." "You are worth watching, Cecily." The use of her name. He had slipped into it sometime in the second hour, and she had not corrected him. Produced a small, involuntary silence that she covered by looking at her hands. "You should know," she said to her hands, "that I am not susceptible to flattery." "I know. That is why I have not offered any." He paused. "I said a true thing. It is not flattery simply because it is pleasant to hear." She looked up. In the candlelight of his aunt's blue salon, her eyes were an unexpectedly warm shade of amber, and she was looking at him with the expression of a woman who has been given something she does not entirely know how to receive. "Edmund," she said. "Yes. Why are you here?" "Truly. You have spent 3 years avoiding precisely this kind of gathering, and you came tonight, and you are sitting here with me specifically, rather than with any of the 40 other people in this room, most of whom have better claims on your attention by every social standard that governs this world." He was quiet for a moment. "Because," he said finally, "I am tired." She waited. "I have been tired for a long time," he said. "Since the continent. Since things I do not discuss at musical evenings." His jaw tightened. "I came back to England 3 years ago, and I built a life that was manageable. Not good, not particularly, but manageable. Ordered. Without risk." He looked at her directly. "And then I walked into a ballroom and found a woman reading Cassini against a wall, while people who have not read a serious book in their lives laughed at her for doing so. And she looked up at them with the most extraordinary composure, and said something that made Lady Worthington flush like a schoolgirl, and I—" He stopped. "And," Cecily said quietly, "and I thought, there is someone who understands what it costs to maintain that kind of composure. There is someone who has been pretending, just as I have, for just as long, and who is very, very tired of it." The room seemed to shrink around them. "You were right," she said after a long pause. Her voice was careful, but beneath the care was something unguarded. "I am tired, dreadfully tired. 3 seasons of being assessed and found wanting will do that." "You were not found wanting," he said. "You were found inconvenient. There is an important difference." She looked at him. "That is a distinction most people do not make." "I have told you, I am not most people." Something shifted in her expression. Something unlocked just slightly, just enough. She did not smile. It was not a smiling moment, but her face changed in a way that suggested she was considering it. "No," she said, "you are not." He called on her 3 days later, and 3 days after that, and twice the following week. He came in the afternoons, when her mother was usually occupied with calls of her own, and the drawing room was quiet and unhurried. He brought books sometimes, a new treatise on astronomy, a philosophical text she had mentioned wanting to read, and they argued about them with the focused pleasure of people who have found someone capable of properly disagreeing with them. He was not easy company. Cecily was honest with herself about this. He had moods that arrived without warning, periods of withdrawal behind his walls that required patience she sometimes struggled to maintain. He asked questions with an intensity that felt like interrogation until she learned to recognize it as the particular attention he paid to things he considered important. He had decided she was important. The realization settled over her slowly, the way understanding sometimes did. Not a sudden revelation, but an accumulation of evidence that reached a weight she could no longer pretend was not there. The Duke of Blackmore was courting her. Actually courting her, not the social performance of courtship designed to achieve a calculated outcome, but something more real and considerably more frightening. A man examining his own life and finding it insufficient, and turning toward her as though she might be the explanation for the insufficiency. She tried, on multiple occasions, to find the trap in it. She could not find one. "You have gone very quiet," he said one afternoon, when they had been reading in companionable silence for half an hour. "I am thinking," she said. "About." She looked at him over the top of her book. "About why you are doing this." He did not pretend to misunderstand. "Sitting in your drawing room reading?" "Courting me," she said plainly, because she had decided weeks ago that she would not pretend she did not see what was happening. "Calling on me, bringing books, attending your aunt's gatherings specifically because you know I will be there." A pause. "I should think it was fairly obvious," he said. "It is obvious that you are doing it. It is not obvious why. You could court anyone, Edmund. Any woman in London would." "I am aware of what any woman in London would do," he said, and there was an edge in his voice she had not heard before. "I have had 3 years of any woman in London. It has been precisely as compelling as you might imagine." Cecily was quiet. "I am not courting you because you are convenient," he said more quietly now. "I am not courting you because you were available or because the timing suited me or because my solicitor has suggested I should marry before the end of the decade." He set down his own book. "I am courting you because when I am not with you, I find that I am thinking about the last conversation we had and looking forward to the next one. And that is something I have not experienced in." He stopped. "A long time," she said. "A very long time." She looked at him. She had learned to read his face over these weeks, and had begun to map the geography of its restraint, where the walls were thickest, where the cracks were, what the almost smile looked like versus the genuine one when it emerged, rare and startling, like something previously hidden. "Edmund," she said. "Yes." "What happened? Before you came back from the continent? What was it that—" She chose her words carefully. "What was it that made you so determined not to feel anything?" The silence that followed was long enough that she thought he would not answer. Then he said, "My brother." He told her over the course of 2 visits. Not all at once. The whole of it was too large for a single conversation, too jagged at the edges, but in pieces the way people tell the stories that have broken them. Carefully, with long pauses, testing the weight of each word before committing it to the air. His brother James had been younger by 4 years, brilliant and reckless in equal measure, possessed of the kind of easy charm that Edmund had never had and had always quietly envied. James had gone to the continent as a military attaché, attached to an embassy in the early years of the peace, and Edmund had followed him 2 years later on work he did not discuss. They had been in Brussels when it happened. A political situation that became an operational one, a decision made in minutes that could not be unmade, and James had been in the wrong place with the wrong information at the wrong time, and Edmund had been the one who survived. He did not say, "I could not save him." He did not need to. Cecily listened. She did not offer consolation. She had learned enough about him to know he would not receive consolation well. But when he finished, when the silence settled around the last word, she said, "You have been carrying that alone for 3 years." "Yes." "Why?" He looked at her. "Because putting it down felt like—" He stopped. "Because as long as I was carrying it, it was still present." He was still. He did not finish the sentence. "You did not want to let him go," she said quietly. "No." She was quiet for a moment. "Edmund." "Yes. Letting go of grief is not the same as letting go of the person." He looked at her with an expression she had not seen from him before. Something raw and undefended. Something that had been kept behind so many layers of careful cold that it had almost forgotten how to show itself. "I know that," he said, "intellectually. But you don't feel it." "Not yet." "Not yet," she echoed, and let the words carry what she meant by them. He looked at her for a long time. "You," he said finally, "are a remarkable woman, Cecily Ashbourne." "I am the woman you found reading Cassini against a wall," she said. "The one they said was too plain for any lord." "Yes," he said, "and they were wrong." She felt it again, that dangerous warmth, that treacherous unlocking, and this time she did not entirely suppress it. "I know," she said, quietly but without equivocation. "I have always known. It simply took someone else seeing it to remind me." The invitation arrived on a Tuesday morning, in the form of a heavy cream envelope bearing the Ashbourne family's modest seal, and a message in her mother's handwriting that managed to convey both triumph and barely suppressed panic in the space of 4 sentences. Lady Grantham's Spring Ball, the most exclusive gathering of the season. Invitations extended, for the first time in 3 years, to include the Ashbourne family. The implication was not subtle. They had been invited because of Edmund. The social mathematics were perfectly clear. Miss Cecily Ashbourne, 3-season wallflower and confirmed spinster in the making, was now connected to the Duke of Blackmore, and Lady Grantham, who had not previously considered the Ashbournes worthy of her guest list, had revised her calculations accordingly. Cecily understood this. She was not naive about the mechanism. What she had not anticipated was the scale of the hostility it would generate. Edmund had not told her about Lady Felicity Hargrove. She learned about Lady Felicity the way she learned most things about the world she navigated, from overheard conversations not intended for her ears. At Lady Grantham's ball, navigating the receiving line on her mother's arm, she caught the shape of it from 3 separate conversations within 20 minutes of arrival. Lady Felicity Hargrove had been, for 2 years, the woman most consistently positioned as the Duke of Blackmore's most probable future wife. She was everything Cecily was not. Titled, wealthy, classically beautiful, possessed of the kind of social perfection that had been cultivated from the cradle. Her mother had been orchestrating the connection with the patient determination of a general conducting a siege, and society had largely accepted the eventual outcome as settled. Until the Ashford ball. Until a plain, bookish, nobody girl with no fortune and no consequence had been danced with by the Ice Duke, specifically and publicly, for the first and only time anyone could remember, and the siege had been lifted entirely. Lady Felicity Hargrove was not, from all available evidence, a gracious loser. Cecily became aware of this approximately 40 minutes into the ball, when the whispers that had been circulating the room began to coalesce into something directed and intentional. Not the casual cruelty of people who found her amusing to dismiss, but something more targeted, coordinated. "I heard she pursued him," a woman near the punch bowl was saying, "quite shamelessly, planted herself in his path, wore something calculated to draw attention. You know the type. The ambitious poor relation," her companion agreed. "Always the most dangerous kind. They have nothing to lose." "And she has nothing," the first woman confirmed. "No fortune, no family of consequence. The connection will embarrass him dreadfully when he comes to his senses." If he comes to his senses. Men can be so foolish when a woman sets herself at them cleverly. Cecily stood very still. She had been heading toward the terrace, seeking air after the heat of the receiving rooms, and she was now effectively trapped in an alcove behind a floral arrangement the size of a small hedge, unable to retreat without passing directly through the conversation. She made herself breathe. She made herself still. She had survived worse than this. She had survived 3 seasons of being Lady Worthington's entertainment, of being Lord Fenwick's consolation prize, of being the last pastry on the plate. She was not going to be undone by whispering women she had never met. "The plain ones are always the most calculating," a new voice said, clearer than the others, with the particular carrying quality of someone who wanted to be heard. "They have to be. Beauty is its own currency. They must manufacture something to compensate." Cecily looked toward the voice. Lady Felicity Hargrove was 22 years old, golden-haired, and possessed of the most perfectly arranged face she had ever seen outside of a portrait. She was also, at this moment, looking directly at Cecily with an expression of sweet, practiced malice. "Miss Ashbourne," Lady Felicity said, with a smile that could have been cut from crystal. "I did not see you there." "No," Cecily said. "I imagine not. We were simply admiring your persistence," Lady Felicity continued, her voice carrying with the effortless projection of a woman raised to command rooms. 3 seasons is quite a dedicated effort. And now, of course, the Duke." A delicate pause. "Though I confess I have always thought he would settle for someone with rather more to recommend her than a willingness to read books in corners." The nearby guests had gone carefully still. Some pretended not to hear. Some did not pretend. "Lady Felicity," Cecily said, and her voice came out exactly as she meant it to, level, unhurried, without the slight quaver she was working to suppress. "I have never pursued anyone in my life. I am not constructed for pursuit. I am constructed for conversation, and your objection, as best I can interpret it, is that I found someone who wished to have one with me. I am sorry if that was inconvenient. Lady Felicity's smile thinned. How very, Miss Ashbourne. The voice was Edmund's. He had come through the ballroom and was standing 5 feet away with an expression she had learned to read. The controlled surface and, beneath it, something tightly leashed and absolutely focused. He looked at Lady Felicity with the particular coldness that was not an absence of feeling but the presence of contained fury. Lady Felicity, he said. His voice could have crystallized the punch. Lady Felicity curtsied. Your Grace, we were simply having a pleasant. No, he said. You were not. A silence. He turned to Cecily, and the temperature of his expression changed entirely. Still controlled, but the control was now over something warm rather than something cold. He offered his hand. Walk with me, he said. She placed her hand on his arm and walked with him through the parted crowd, feeling the combined stare of the assembled company like a weight across her shoulders, and concentrated on putting one foot steadily in front of the other. They reached the terrace. The night air was cool and smelled of rain and late spring flowers. Cecily let out a long, careful breath. Are you all right? He said. It was not quite a question. Yes, she said. No, I don't know. He was quiet for a moment. I should have warned you. About Lady Felicity? About the general disposition of things. I knew there would be consequences for you. I should have been clearer about what those consequences might be. Cecily looked at him. He was standing with his hands clasped behind his back, staring out at the dark garden with an expression that she recognized now as the face he made when he was angry with himself. Edmund, she said. The things she said were unpleasant but not new, she said. I have heard variations of them for 3 seasons. They do not, she paused. They sting less than they used to. That is something. They should not sting at all. His jaw was tight. You are the most. Edmund. She turned to face him fully. I know what I am. I have always known. What has changed is that I have found someone else who also knows, and that changes the arithmetic considerably. He looked at her. Say it plainly, he said quietly. What do you mean? I mean, she said, that I have spent 3 years believing the general consensus, believing that there was something insufficient about me that produced my invisibility. And then you sat down beside me and talked to me for 40 minutes about orbital mechanics and I thought. She stopped. What did you think? I thought he sees something. I do not know what he sees. But he sees something, and I am so unspeakably tired of being the woman that no one sees. Edmund was very still. I see, he said. Everything. The words were quiet, precise, offered without ornament. I know, she said. Her voice cracked slightly on the 2 words. He reached out and took her hand, not with the formal positioning of a dance hold, but simply, deliberately, the way one person takes another person's hand when they need them to know something that words have not fully managed to convey. Cecily. Yes. I am going to go back in there and make something very clear to Lady Felicity and everyone else who was within earshot of that conversation. She felt a flicker of alarm. Edmund, you don't? I know I don't have to, he said. I want to. There is a difference. He looked at her hand in his, then up at her face. Stay here, he said. It'll be 5 minutes. He went back inside. She did not know exactly what he said. She was not there to hear it. What she heard, when she eventually returned to the ballroom on his arm, was the particular quality of silence that followed something significant. A silence that was in the process of converting itself into the kind of conversation that would sustain a season of gossip. She saw Lady Felicity's expression, pale and carefully controlled. She saw Lady Grantham watching from across the room with undisguised fascination. She saw Lady Worthington, who had somehow materialized among the observers, wearing an expression that she could not immediately categorize. Edmund was at her side, his hand at the small of her back, with the particular proprietorial care of a man who has made something clear and intends to continue making it clear. What did you say? She asked quietly, as they moved through the room. I said, he replied, equally quiet, that Miss Ashbourne is under my protection, and that further commentary of the nature I had observed would be regarded by me as a personal insult, with all the consequences that entails. Cecily considered this. That was quite direct. I find that directness is undervalued in social discourse. It tends to create enemies. It also creates clarity. He looked down at her, which I find preferable. She thought about Lady Felicity's pale face and the silence that had fallen over the gathered company, and understood that something had shifted tonight, permanently and publicly, in the social calculus that governed her life. She should have been grateful. Instead, she felt something far more complicated rising in her chest, something warm and frightening and insistent. "Edmund," she said. "Yes. I need to tell you something." "All right." She stopped walking. They were in a relatively quiet stretch of the ballroom's edge, and she turned to face him directly, because she was Cecily Ashbourne and she did not approach important things obliquely. "I am in love with you," she said. "I have been for some time. I am not asking you to say anything about it. I simply needed to say it, because I have been editing myself for 3 seasons and I have decided not to do that anymore, at least not with you." The expression that crossed his face was unlike anything she had seen from him before. Something stripped and unguarded shock, and beneath the shock something that had been waiting, she thought, for exactly these words. He opened his mouth. "You don't have to," she began. "Cecily. I'm not asking." "Cecily." His voice was rough. "Be quiet for a moment." She was quiet. "I have been," he said slowly, as though finding the words by touch in the dark, "trying to find the right time to tell you something for the past 3 weeks, and every time I constructed the words, they seemed inadequate. Every time I arranged the sentence, it seemed insufficient for what I actually meant." He looked at her. "What I mean," he said, "is that you are the reason I came back. Not literally, I was already back before I met you, but the reason I came back to life, to the possibility of life, to the idea that there might be something worth feeling again after 3 years of choosing not to feel anything." "Edmund, I love you," he said, simply and completely, and in a way I was fairly certain I had destroyed myself before you sat down at a wall at the Ashford ball with your planetary mechanics and refused to be grateful. The ghost of the smile, fuller now than she had ever seen it, turned almost into the real thing. "I love you, Cecily, and I would very much like, if you are agreeable, to spend the rest of my life telling you so." The ballroom continued around them, all its noise and motion and social machinery. 300 people attended to their own dramas and their own negotiations and their own quiet wars. And here, in the quiet at the edge of it, 2 people who had both spent years making themselves small and cold and invisible, looking at each other. "I am," Cecily said, her voice entirely steady, "extremely agreeable." He proposed the following Thursday. Not at another ball, not in public, not with an audience of calculating observers. He came to her family's drawing room in the morning, when her father was home, and he spoke to her father first. Formally, correctly, with the particular gravity of a man who understands that ceremony matters. And then he came to her in the garden, where she was reading, because she was always reading, and he sat down across from her and said, without preamble, "Marry me." She looked up from her book. "That is not a question," she observed. "No," he agreed. "I considered phrasing it as one, but I find that questions imply uncertainty, and I am not uncertain." "About me?" "About you." She looked at him, this complicated, guarded, extraordinary man with his frost and his scars and his genuine, careful, effortful love. She thought about James. She thought about Brussels. She thought about the 3 years he had spent building walls he had now entirely dismantled for her, stone by careful stone. "Edmund," she said. "Yes. You understand that marrying me will be considered by most of society to be an eccentric decision at best. I am aware. I am not beautiful in any conventional sense. I am opinionated. I read in corners at social events. I will argue with you when I think you are wrong, and I will frequently be right. I am counting on all of those things," he said. "My family has no money and limited connections. My family has sufficient money for all purposes and connections I have no interest in deploying socially. These seem to me like complementary qualities. She felt her lips move. "You are impossible. I have been told." He leaned forward slightly, his elbows on his knees, his dark eyes holding hers with the directness she had learned to treasure. "Cecily, I have spent 3 years building a life that was safe and empty and entirely without joy. I have found that I no longer want it. I want this. I want the arguments about orbital mechanics and the afternoons in your drawing room and the way you look when you forget to edit yourself. I want to give you a room full of books and the freedom to read every one of them. I want to walk into a room with you and watch people discover that the woman they dismissed for 3 seasons is the most extraordinary person in it." He reached across the small garden table and took her hand. "Marry me," he said again. "Please." The please was what undid her. The please was the crack in the wall, the unguarded thing, the evidence of want stripped of armor. "Yes," she said. "Obviously yes." The announcement created, as she had predicted, considerable sensation. It was not the sensation of simple surprise. London society was past simple surprise, but the more complex sensation of an established narrative being overturned. The Duke of Blackmore, who was meant to marry wealth and beauty and consequence, was marrying Miss Cecily Ashbourne, who had 3 seasons of being found insufficient behind her and a copy of Cassini in her reticule. Lady Felicity Hargrove withdrew from the season citing a family matter in the country. Lady Worthington was observed to have very little to say for the first time in recent memory. The Marchioness of Dalton hosted a dinner for the couple and delivered a speech that left several guests in tears and one elderly general visibly unmanned. Through it all, Cecily attended to the business of becoming engaged to the Duke of Blackmore with the focused competence she brought to everything, and tried to understand the feeling she carried constantly now, warm and bright, that took her some time to identify correctly. She had been invisible for so long. She was not invisible anymore. Not because of Edmund's consequence, though that was certainly part of the social arithmetic, but because he saw her, specifically, completely, without the editorial corrections society had always imposed. He saw her and he had chosen her, publicly and deliberately and without apparent concern for what the general consensus had to say about it. She understood that this was what love was supposed to do. She had simply never experienced it before. 2 weeks before the wedding, she heard the final echo of Lady Felicity's campaign. She was in Bond Street with the Marchioness of Dalton, attending to matters of bridal preparation, when she encountered a group of women she recognized from 3 seasons of peripheral observation. They saw her. There was a moment of calculation, visible, almost mechanical, and then one of them spoke. "Miss Ashbourne, congratulations on your forthcoming marriage. No one expected me to be here at all," Cecily said pleasantly. 3 seasons of being too plain for any lord will produce that impression. She smiled. It turns out the lords were looking in the wrong direction. She offered a perfectly correct curtsy and walked on. The Marchioness, beside her, made a sound that was not quite a laugh. "My nephew," she said, "has made an excellent choice." "He has," Cecily agreed. He was simply the first one clever enough to recognize it. They were married on a Thursday. Cecily had requested Thursday specifically. Edmund had asked why, and she had told him that it was the day of his aunt's musical, the day everything had properly begun, and he had looked at her with the expression she loved best, the one where the almost smile became the real smile and his entire face changed, and agreed without argument. The wedding was not elaborate. This was also at Cecily's request. She had spent 3 seasons watching society's most elaborate productions and had concluded that the most important things did not require spectacle. Edmund had agreed immediately and with evident relief. It was in her parish church with her family and his aunt and a selection of people they actually liked, and Edmund stood at the altar with the particular expression of a man who has arrived somewhere he did not expect to arrive and is still slightly processing the miracle of it. When she came down the aisle, he watched her with the expression she had first seen at the Marchioness's musical, the focused, wondering attention of someone who cannot quite believe his luck, and she walked toward him with the steady certainty of a woman who has spent 3 seasons being overlooked and understands, with complete clarity, that she will not be overlooked again. "You look," he said quietly, when she reached him, "extraordinary." "I look like myself," she said. "Yes," he agreed. "That is what I said." 13 years later, Blackmore House was loud on a Friday afternoon. It was loud with the specific productive chaos of a household that contained 3 children under 10, a library that had overflowed into 2 adjacent rooms, a husband who had opinions about dinner and was not shy about expressing them, and a wife who was currently in the middle of a letter to the Royal Academy that she intended to send under her own name, which was still considered a somewhat irregular thing to do, and which she considered precisely correct. Mama, her eldest, a girl of 9 with Edmund's dark hair and her own amber eyes, appeared in the doorway with an expression of principled grievance. Thomas has taken my Herschel and refuses to return it. The book or the astronomer? The book, obviously. The astronomer is dead. Tell Thomas the first said to return it, or he will forfeit his evening reading entirely. Her daughter departed with the satisfied air of someone who has successfully deployed a superior authority. Cecily returned to her letter, and had added 2 sentences when Edmund appeared in the doorway, holding a smaller child under one arm with the ease of long practice. Your son, he said, setting the child down with gentle precision, has been attempting to dissect the mechanical clock in the study. Again. He is curious, Cecily said without looking up. He has taken out 4 screws. I cannot find 2 of them. They are under the bookcase. They were also under the bookcase last time. A pause. How do you? I know where everything is in this house, Edmund. I have always known where everything is. It is one of the things you have never fully appreciated. She heard him come further into the room, heard the particular sound of him settling into the chair beside her desk, the one he had carried in from the study on their first afternoon at Blackmore House because he had decided he would spend his time where she was, and 14 years had not changed that habit. You are writing the Academy letter, he said. I am finishing the Academy letter. They will publish it. They will argue about whether to publish it for 6 months and then publish it because the mathematics are irrefutable. This is what I love about you, he said. Your complete confidence in your own irrefutability. She set down her pen and looked at him. He was, she thought, even more himself at 49 than he had been at 36. The silver at his temples had spread further. The lines around his eyes were deeper. The scar along his jaw that she had traced so many times she knew it by feel now. He was reading the newspaper with the half-focused expression that meant he was also thinking about something else, and he looked. She searched for the word content. Not happy in the performed social way. Not satisfied in the satisfied way. Content, genuinely, in the way of a man who has landed somewhere he had not expected to find and has spent 13 years discovering how right it was. Edmund, she said. Yes. Do you remember? She paused. The Ashford ball. When you sat down beside me. Of course. What made you sit down? Truly. I have always assumed it was Lady Worthington's group. That you heard them and that was part of it. He set down the newspaper. But I had noticed you before that. When I came in. She blinked. I didn't see you come in. I know. The almost smile, the real one. The one that still startled her pleasantly after all this time. You were reading. You were entirely absorbed. Everyone else in the room was performing, doing what people do at balls, assessing and being assessed, and you were just there, reading. Like the room was an inconvenience you were tolerating. It was. I know. That's why I noticed you. He looked at her steadily. I have been performing for 3 years. Being the Ice Duke, the formidable, the cold, whatever they wanted to call me. And I walked into that ballroom and there was a woman who had simply refused to perform, who was sitting against the wall reading a serious book while people laughed at her, and who looked. He stopped. How did I look? Like yourself, he said. Entirely, unapologetically, stubbornly yourself. And I thought, I have forgotten how to do that. I have forgotten what it looks like. He reached across the desk and took her hand, the way he had on the terrace at Lady Grantham's ball, simply and deliberately. You reminded me, he said. That is the true answer. You reminded me who I was before I decided to stop feeling things. And I sat down beside you because I thought, if I stay near this woman, I might remember how to come back. Cecily looked at this man, her husband, her argument, her home, and felt the familiar warmth move through her chest like sunlight through glass. And did you? She asked. Come back. He raised her hand and pressed his lips to her knuckles. a gesture so habitual and so utterly unperformative that it made her eyes sting every time. "Every single day," he said. From somewhere in the house came the sound of a door opening, children's voices raised in negotiation, the particular crash of something that was almost certainly the contested Herschel. Cecily and Edmund looked at each other. "Yours," she said. "Ours," he corrected, and stood. They had said she was too plain for any lord. They had been measuring the wrong thing. She had not been too plain. She had been too real, too honest, too unperforming, too much herself for rooms that preferred their women decorative and their intelligence invisible. And it had taken a man who had himself forgotten how to be real to walk across a ballroom full of glittering, performing, assessing people, and sit down beside her. She had not needed rescuing, but she had needed, as it turned out, seeing. And the Duke of Blackmoor, Edmund, her impossible, wonderful, endlessly exasperating Edmund, had seen her. Everything. From the very first. Here ends the tale of the Duke who stopped the ball. He did not stop it for beauty or for wealth or for the correct performance of femininity. He stopped it because he found, against the east wall of Ashford House's ballroom, a woman reading Cassini. And he understood immediately and completely that he had found the most interesting person in the room. He was right. He was, in the end, almost always right about the things that mattered. And Cecily, who had spent 3 seasons being found insufficient, spent the rest of her life being found essential. Which was, she had always suspected, what she had been all along.